Well, we are in our study of tensions and paradox, and here the last several classes, last few weeks, we've been talking about some paradoxes that relate to the nature and attributes of God. Maybe some of his sterner and some of his softer attributes and how these go together. And along with that, also how we relate to God in terms of his grace and our response to that grace, his grace and our faith, and also how faith and works and obedience and all of these things fit together. And some of this is a struggle because I think how inadequate could any of us, or all of us, to try to explain God and explain the interface between us and him. This is about as, I would say it is the most massive sort of thing that a human being could seek to undertake. And the words from Psalm 19:4 have been ringing in my ear today as we come to sort of a flex session, a little bit of a review or overview of these topics that we've been discussing. And that's where the psalmist himself says, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, so in your sight. So that's, I think, a proper frame of mind to launch into this from, and hopefully we do more good than harm in the process. So we again have been talking about some of God's stern attributes, some of God's softer attributes, the severity and the kindness, as Paul puts it in Romans, of God. And we've tried to show how both of these attributes are true. That God does have anger. He is wrathful at sin. And sometimes the distinction between the sin and the sinner becomes very hard to distinguish. And God does have wrath at that. But he is also very long-suffering and very patient. He's a God of justice. And he is a God of love. He's a God who has standards. He's not wishy-washy or infinitely malleable, but he is also a God of amazing grace. And so trying to embrace both of these, and what we've endeavored to do is to show that both of these sides of God's nature are true, that they are revealed to us in Scripture. And we've tried to see that when we let go of one side in order to hold on to the other at the expense of holding and embracing both, we end up with something that's very weird, something that's very lopsided. And I thought one of the ways that we could maybe try to describe that is we end up with an idol when we hold to one set of attributes at the expense of the other. And maybe two ways to describe that, depending on which way you tend to lean on it, is you end up either with affirm me God or guilt me God. Some of you may remember I did a sermon years ago using some of these kinds of ideas. But I think it's kind of a revelation of where we go when we just hold fast to one side of what's revealed about the nature of God, either his softer attributes or his sterner ones. So talking about these a little bit more in detail, affirm me God is the God who affirms every moral and spiritual decision that I make. I mean, at first glance, who wouldn't want that God, right? The God that whatever I want to do, God just steps in there and says, awesome, go for it. Or whatever I want to think, God says, yeah, I'll put my stamp of approval on top of that. I mean, it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And we can come to God, if we're thinking this way, with questions like, can I cheat on my exam? And affirm me God will say, well, everybody cheats a little bit, so, don't beat yourself up about that. Or we can ask, hey, can I move in with my boyfriend? Well, I know that you really love each other, so sure, why not? You need to find out how compatible you are before you tie the knot. Or, can I leave my wife and marry my secretary? that kind of thing. And he's like, well, ordinarily I'm against that kind of stuff, but I know how hard you've tried, and she understands you so well. So in this case, I'm willing to make an exception. Or can I just offer up anything that I like and call it worship, and you'll be okay with that? And Affirm Me God's like, yeah, it's just be sincere in your heart, and everything is good. In any case, Affirm Me God will always be there to tell you that it's okay. And this view has an anthem. It has a song. Anybody have any ideas what song might pair well with this idea?
Give us a group.
Lady Gaga.
You're going to have to help us out here. Sing it for us.
There you go. Now we all know what you listen to.
And you.
And me. Born This Way. Well, I only know it because Carrie Dalton gave an invitation one time and talked about the song. So that's how I learned about it. So Born This Way. Hey, it doesn't matter what you are. God is just okay with that. And no matter what you do or what you think, God's there to affirm you. Well, this obviously is an idol of our imagining. This isn't the true God that's revealed to us in Scripture. And we'll come back to talk about in a few moments some of the problems that are associated with just embracing these attributes of God. So on the other end of that spectrum, we would have Guilt Me God. He's the opposite of Affirm Me God. Instead of always being happy with anything you do, this God is never happy with anything that you do. This God loves you very much, and He's going to send you to hell. You have a very, very slim chance of making it into heaven. He controls with guilt and fear, and his default switch is set to no. Okay? If there's a question that comes to your mind, you're thinking about asking God about it, you don't really need to ask, because the answer is going to be no. He's the God of technicalities and fine print. In other words, he's the God that you may have really lived a life of devotion and sacrifice and faith, but you may show up at the pearly gates and find out there's some fine print that you didn't quite notice, and so I'd like to let you in, but rules are rules, and you're just out. So this is Guilt Me God. This also has an anthem. You're never going to get this one, because actually I learned weird things that come up in preparing for a lesson. I don't know. I thought it was a Johnny Cash song, because that's where I heard it from, but it's actually just an old American folk song. Anybody ever heard of I don't even know what the title of the song is. I just know how it goes. I'm not going to sing it. You can run on for a long time, but what? Sooner or later, God's going to cut you down, right? Everybody ever heard that one? Johnny Cash fans? You heard that? I wasn't a huge Johnny Cash fan until he died, and then I started listening to some of his last few albums, and they are phenomenal. So. Anyway, there's one of his songs in there is, you can run on for a long time, but you just, sooner or later, He's going to get you. And maybe all of us have had experiences in our own minds, or in our families, or in our church experiences with what we perceive to be one of these gods or the other. Maybe you had one parent who might have been the Affirm Me God parent, and the other was the Guilt Me God parent. If you did, probably growing up, you knew which one of those you liked best. But there's problems with both of these, and so the first question is, what's some of the problems that are associated with conceptualizing God as one who is always there to affirm whatever it is that you wanted to do? Sounds good, but what are problems? Practical, real-life problems that would come from thinking of God this way.
think justice would be an impossibility.
Okay.
Because that necessitates a relationship between two people. And if they are being affirmed in ways that, well, it's likely that they would be affirmed in ways that would perpetuate some sort of an injustice.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of funny. We want to affirm me, God, when it comes to me. But when it comes to you, and especially if we've got a bit of a conflict, we want guilt me, God, or justice, God, for you. So affirm me, God, for me, and justice, God, for you. And yeah, like you say, it would be very difficult for us to ever be able to think of how could we address God to seek justice for wrongs done. And I think that affirm me, God, is most likely going to show up in times of prosperity and peace and ease, like many of us, my generation and younger, have grown up in. If you are living in a place where you are suffering grave injustices, affirm me, God, is probably not going to be the most popular idol around. Probably not too many affirm me, God people in eastern Ukraine right now, wanting God just to approve of anything and everything that happens, right? So that's a great one. What else? What else is a problem with thinking of God this way?
Suggest that what I want at the moment is ultimately what's good for me.
Yes. That what I want at the moment is what is ultimately good for me. And that sort of means that there's no room for growth, is there? It's like whatever my heart desires in this present circumstance is the supreme good, and there's therefore no higher standard that I should seek after. This kind of God eventually is going to be very disappointing, because he's going to be affirming constantly things that down the road, to your point, turn out not to be so good. Well, you told me I could move in with my boyfriend. That hasn't turned out to be such a good thing. Why didn't you tell me, that this was a bad idea? And so, kind of like a girl dating a boy who has no will of his own, but just is so smitten with her that he does whatever his girlfriend asks. Pretty soon, that's cool at the beginning, but pretty soon it's like, you're really not very necessary in this relationship. So ends up losing its power. Yes.
I think it, in a way, makes your worship more on you rather than God, because you're thinking, what makes me feel good? What do I want to do, rather than what does God want me to do?
Yeah. Very self-referential. It puts me, at the center, and my ideas become God's ideas. And again, so there's no higher thing to strive after. Just what I am is as good as it gets. And I think all of us recognize that we aren't as good as we ought to be, and we need some sort of better to strive for. Yes.
Affirming God kind of makes it so that God is pointless in that scenario. If every single decision I'm making is morally correct because I feel that it's morally correct, that makes me infallible and all-knowing and infinitely wise. And why do you need God to affirm your decisions if they're all always right?
Exactly. Which means when we're reading Scripture and we come across those passages that we're like, man, I don't like that. Well, that's when we need to especially sit up and say, well, what good is a God who always told me what I wanted to hear in the first place? And so what I need right here is to humble myself and acknowledge that God is God and I am not. And if I can't do that, then God becomes superfluous. Yes. Oh, sorry. It's like an auction. You just bought a cow.
It cheapens the cross. When you do that, it makes it, why did he have to go to such horrible lengths to save people then nothing's really wrong.
Grace then just becomes this mushy sort of, boys will be boys kind of thing, rather than God having standards that have to be honored, and that there really is a price for sin, and that Christ has ransomed us from that.
Oh, there's no submission. So you're not recognizing that there's a higher authority than you. And it goes back to Julia's point where, you cheapen the cross, because the cross is for us one of the, it is the pinnacle of what we believe in.
Yes.
And so if you're cheapening that, and if you're not recognizing or submitting to that, there's no other standard.
All right, well, very good. Now, are there any problems with guilt me God? I mean, God's gonna keep you in line. So maybe this is the way to go, but maybe not. What are some problems that we can think of associated with this?
Again, it kind of renders the cross pointless. Like,
Okay.
then what did he die for if nobody could make it to heaven? If your chances are so slim, why did Jesus carry the sin of the world?
Okay, very good. It really does render the power of the cross to bring forgiveness and to make salvation a real reality for those who turn to God. It's always in doubt, and really puts the emphasis again away from what God has done to make access to Him a real thing, and just always becomes sort of self-referential again, in that, am I adequate to transcend myself and become good enough for God to accept me?
Yeah, I mean, Lance, you and I were running yesterday, talking about this a little bit. You had made reference in a sermon recently about, or maybe in class, about many older folks, as they approach the end of their life, you've talked with, and, have expressed this self-referential, as you said, I'm not good enough. And I think this begins to feed into that, as you start digging deeper into this, maybe some of that's just the effects of aging and, our mind. But it also you start taking the wrong view of God. You're viewing God, as you expressed here before, as just keeping you over this tightrope with the flames of hell underneath you. Okay, I got you. Rather than the God who, as Shani was saying, who wants us to be safe so much, He sent His own Son. I mean, thinking of God. So our thought process of God has, I think, something to do with this problem you mentioned.
Yeah, that's good. And it really kind of helps when you think of it that way, to put these two things in the proper place. A God who is for you, and this genuine desire to establish this saving relationship with you, would also be a God who doesn't want to leave you in the grip of your deceitful desires. He wants to not only reach you where you're at, but He wants to draw you out of that, so that you become more of what you could be and what you ought to be as an image-bearing creature. Yeah.
It seems like it creates, this idea would create disciples that follow still as slaves to sin and fear, rather than people who are bold, confident, in peace and joy as servants of God, rather than still serving Him out of fear and still a slave to the fear that comes with sin. Not to say that you sin all the more that grace may abound. That's, as Paul says, certainly not. But that shouldn't be a burden that you hang around your neck waiting to be caught.
She's got better plans than me.
No. It just made me think of the parable of the master and the three servants, and he gave them money, and the servant that hid his because he was afraid. And I think it can paralyze you sometimes when you fear God and you're not looking to do His will and seeking out opportunities, you're kind of thinking about yourself and worried about yourself instead of looking at God's plan for you.
Yeah, that's powerful, because that parable just, I think about it a lot, because in some ways it shows us that how we conceive of God in a very real sense becomes the reality of who God is as far as we're concerned. If I can explain that. The first two saw their master as someone who could be pleased, and that was who was for them, and they were willing to take a risk, and out of that view of who their master was, they were able to make an increase. They were able to make a gain, and when the time of judgment came, the story just, if you read it, they're just chomping at the bit. They can't wait to come before their master and show him, look, they say, all of them, look, you gave me this, and look what I did with what you gave me. And so, they see him as a master that can be pleased, and so it draws that out of them. Whereas this other one, he's a hard man. He draws a hard line, and so yeah, I'm just in this grip of fear. I'm just going to dig and put it in the dirt. And so again, this concept of what you think God is kind of becomes the reality that you're going to live in, and the end result is being cast out. You thought he was hard, and he is. The others thought he could be pleased and were welcomed in. So it is important that we not fall into thinking of God in this simplistic sort of way. I'm sorry.
No, I didn't know. Well, I was just going to say, because the other power at hand is Satan here, that with either one of these gods that he probably tries to convince us that exist, the end result is the same, that he's trying to accomplish the same thing, and really can produce the same type of disciple. With the guilt God, one person may just say, well, I'm never going to be good enough, whatever the case is, so I'm just going to do whatever I want. And the affirm God, that same person could say, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want, because he, and here I go down the road of destruction.
There's no growth or change or transformation in either case.
Yeah, and so Satan, gets a hold of that person either way.
Yes. Yeah, the thing that to me happens a lot with this, that I see happen with this all the time, is either I've had innumerable examples of people I've known who quit the Lord, who leave the church because I could never be good enough to do this. And in some ways, at least, I feel like these people are kind of honest. Then there's another group of people who are like, okay, well, if that's the way God is, then what I've got to do is actually take his laws and commandments and turn them into a checklist that I feel like I can do. And that way I'll know that I have met the requirements and I'll be in. But what they're actually doing is, to use the analogy, they've taken the goal and lowered it to the level that they can dunk on it, and said, if it's 7 feet high, I can dunk on it. And in some ways, that's what the Pharisees did. We usually think of them as adding and making it more difficult, but there were other ways where they convenienced themselves very much by taking God's really comprehensive laws and simplifying them into things that they could check off and say, yeah, I did that, I did that, I did that. And whatever I can't do must not really be God's law. Yes.
I think those of us that have grown up in a Christian home, we may wrestle with this, but we work through it, and it may be a lifelong wrestle even, but for the person who doesn't know God and is trying to learn about him, if that's the God they meet, then their response is, why try? So we need to be careful about how we present God.
Yes, we do. How we think of him and how we present him to others. Well, very good. Thank you all for that. What I'd like to do in our remaining time is talk about how John then presents Jesus. Because once more, it seems like Jesus is the one who's going to help us, if not resolve these tensions, at least see them in flesh and blood. And I love the way that John, who knew Jesus perhaps better than anyone, and at the end, toward the end of his life, wrote a biography about the life of Jesus, describes him as the God, the Logos, the Word made flesh to come and dwell among men. And when he describes him in the prologue of his book, he says it this way: the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory is the only Son from the Father. So here's the one that's going to help us see the Father truly, to see him accurately, to see him as he really is, and not as we might project him to be, either in the guilt me God or the affirm me God, whatever our inclinations might be. And John says when his glory, when the glory of the true God was revealed to him, we saw that he was full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. And then in verse 17, and just notice the word full. He's not partially any of these things, but he's full of it. Then he repeats this idea in verse 17 where he says the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, this is a little bit complicated because I used to set grace and truth in opposition to each other as the two things that were the tension that's being addressed here. And the more I've thought about it and the way that John uses the word truth in his gospel, which appears some 25 times, it seems that he's putting grace and truth not in sort of opposition to each other as opposite parts of a tension, but rather they're more grace and truth go together as very complementary. And here it's like what the law that came through Moses is the thing that's kind of set in tension with the grace and truth. Truth, the word truth, aletheia, is one of those words where the A at the beginning is sort of negating. What do you call that? I don't know. It's like atheist means someone who does not have God or does not believe in God. Atheist. So aletheia is the same way. Lethea means concealed or veiled or concealed. And aletheia means not veiled or concealed. So Jesus is the one who comes without concealment to reveal who God really is. And so in John, very often when you see the word truth, he is saying what's really real. Okay? As opposed to, for instance, the law of Moses or the temple and tabernacle. John 4, his discussion with the woman at the well, worship in spirit and in truth. Truth, again, there is not set in contrast to what's false, because he says the Jews were worshiping at the temple, but God's seeking those who worship him in spirit and in truth. He's saying not that the temple worship was false worship, but it wasn't the real thing. The real thing is in Jesus, and God is seeking those who worship him in the real temple, in the place where God is really at and where men can truly interface with him honestly, openly, and not through the shadows or the copies. It's kind of like Hebrews 9 talks about the shadows of the tabernacle were a copy, not the true tabernacle, which is in heaven. And again, the Hebrew writer is not saying that the old Jewish law was false and the new is the true, but the other was the shadow. It was the copy. It was a physical representation of a deeper spiritual reality. So Jesus is full of grace and the real thing, not just the shadow or the copy that came with Moses, a precursor, a grammar, but the substance, the reality, the real thing. So we don't want to put the opposition where it doesn't belong, but there is a sense, I think, in which we can say that truth also represents, for John and elsewhere in Scripture, the idea of this just being real. How we can relate to God in a way that is not phony and not in pretense and not in shadow, but in the real, honest, open way of being connected with God. And so as Jesus comes and shows us grace and truth, we often see the sterner and softer sides of God revealed in the same stories. Over and over again, you see both of these things held together as Jesus interacts with sinners. And I've got a few of them down here in my notes. And then we'll just go with them rather than letting you mess up my perfect plan. So the first of these is when Jesus calls Matthew. I love this story. Jesus calls Matthew. If you want to follow along, you can look at Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Somebody read that for us, verses 9 through 13.
As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Very good. Where in this story do you see the stern attributes of God, and where do you see the soft attributes of God? Do you see both?
The phrase there, "go and learn,"
Okay.
was often used historically by a rabbi
Okay.
to rebuke someone, like, you should know this already.
Okay.
Go and learn. And so these religious leaders, or those that thought they were morally superior, he is saying, go and learn this. You ought to know that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So I feel like that's kind of that's the rebuke part
Okay.
of that.
So there's a rebuke toward the Pharisees who are questioning Jesus' actions, and he's telling them, you ought to have understood what I was doing. And if you had been paying attention, you would have known this already. So that's a very stern statement. Good. Anything else? Stern or soft, and I don't know if those are the right terms to use, but best I got right now.
Well, the compassion, I guess, would be, he's there to help the sick.
Okay.
That shows his compassion or soft side, yes.
Their sickness is an analogy here for their sinfulness and their immoral practices or whatever other problems that they've got, but he came for them, for that. So he didn't find their soul disease so off-putting that he wouldn't step into the situation to try to deal with it. Okay. What
There's
about
an acknowledgement that they have a soul disease.
Okay. Yeah, to me, it's one of those really interesting things. First he calls Matthew, which is like, that's crazy, a tax collector. But he tells him, you become one of my disciples. You follow me. I want you close to me. And in the Chosen series, Peter really does not like this. It says something about, this is highly unusual. Isn't that what he says? And what did Jesus say?
Better get used to that.
Better get used to unusual. So, highly unusual and highly offensive. And it's not only that he calls him to follow with Jesus, but then Matthew puts on this feast, and Jesus comes into his house, and there are other tax collectors, many of them, and sinners who are in the house there, and Jesus is sitting there eating with them. Scandalous to the Pharisees, so you can sort of see them sending messages into the house. Hey, what's going on? Why is Jesus doing this? And Jesus is sort of sitting there with them and sends a message back and says, hey, I didn't come to call the righteous but sinners to repentance. And they're all sitting there going, what'd you just call us? Sinners, yeah. So, I mean, he's not like saying, well, you guys really aren't that bad. He's like, man, you guys are a mess, okay? You guys are sinners. You guys have got problems. You need a doctor. I'm here to heal your diseased soul. So, I mean, that's pretty direct, hard-hitting truth. But I'm also here for you. It's like, you guys are in bad shape, but I love you. And that's where the tension comes together, and we see, again, from what John says, we look and we see the glory of God revealed in Jesus Christ. Yes.
In the film Jesus of Nazareth, the filmmaker used this setup as an occasion where Jesus then tells the parable of the prodigal son. And it is, you've nailed it, that scene really speaks to both Jesus reaching out, and embracing these people, and at the same time convicting them.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Okay. And Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like Jesus isn't there with them to become, what they are, but he's there with them as they are to make them more like what he is. Very good. All right. What about, let's think of another one. What about the Samaritan woman? This is Jared's favorite Bible story. John, the 4th chapter. You remember her? What was her issue?
Well, the disciples would say it was because she was a Samaritan was her issue.
Number one, she's a Samaritan. Why is that a problem?
They don't interact with you.
They don't interact with Jews, and why don't they? They don't like each other.
Their worship is tainted.
Their worship is tainted. They have a corrupted version of the Old Testament scriptures, some false notions about the character and nature of God, and they worship in the wrong place, at Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem at the Jewish temple. So they're all messed up religiously. They're ethnically impure. They're considered like half-breeds between Jews and Gentiles, and there's a history for why that's the case. Had to do with the exile and other people coming in and intermarrying with the Jews who were left behind. So there's any number of borders that Jesus is transgressing. I don't mean he's transgressing God's law. He's transgressing human customs in order to reach this woman where she is at. And then she's a woman, right? And also that's just not done. And so here's a Jewish rabbi sitting at a well with a Samaritan woman. What else about her?
She's had 5 husbands, and the man she's with is not her.
Okay. She's been with a lot of men and married multiple times, and the guy that she's with now, she's not even married to. So, and Jesus sits down and asks her to do him a favor, which is an interesting thing, isn't it? Would you give me a drink of water? Well, I mean, there's a closeness about that. I mean, will you use your vessel to draw water, and then I'll put my Jewish rabbi lips to your Samaritan woman vessel and drink from it? And she's shocked that he would interact with her in this way. They begin to have a discussion. Pretty soon he reveals to her that he knows things about her that there's no way he should know these things. And she is convinced pretty quickly that he must be a prophet to know what he knows. And that's when Jesus goes straight to the heart of the matter and gets into the sinful part of her life. Just brings it straight up. You can bring your husband. I'm not married. Yeah, I know you're not married. You've been with all these guys. You're living with a guy now you're not married to. So like the most sensitive part of who she is, Jesus goes straight to it. And I found it fascinating. What's her initial reaction to that?
Sidestep.
Huh?
To sidestep what he just said.
Sidestep. And she sidesteps it how? This is fascinating. What does she ask?
A religious question.
A religious question. We're getting too personal here. You're getting too much of my business and who I am and who God is and all that. Let's just have a religious debate. Where's the right place to worship? And Jesus doesn't let her go there, does he? He says, look, you guys say Mount Gerizim, the Jews say Jerusalem. The Jews, as far as that's concerned, have it right, but it's actually irrelevant because it doesn't have anything to do. The time is coming has nothing to do with the place. It has everything to do with, in spirit and in truth, that is not in a human copy tabernacle, a shadow, but in the true spiritual reality of what God is after, is worshipers in truth, real worshipers. You're connecting with God, not by getting to the right place and procedures, but having an intimate, personal connection with God who is transforming them into becoming the obedient children that he is calling them to be. So fascinating interaction where he doesn't pull punches about her condition, but he's right there with her. A couple more very quickly because our time is almost up. I talked a few weeks ago in the Lord's Supper, talked about the woman taken in adultery in John the 8th chapter. Amazing grace there, literally saves her life and says, I do not condemn you, but what? Go and sin no more. Go and leave your life of sin. And then there's the thief on the cross, which is, again, an amazing story of God interacting with sinners, and the guy says, I'm deserving of death, and Jesus is like, no argument there. Yeah, you're getting what you deserve, but you're also going to be this very day with me in paradise. So if we're going to ourselves understand and project to others a true image of God, we're going to have to deal with the messiness and the difficulty of both being radically committed to truth and reality and the stern things of God, as well as being willing to be right there in the middle of it with people, for people in their sin as we try to help them and ourselves, because we're desperately in need of that grace and truth ourselves. All right. Thank you guys so much.